there was data. And companies saw that it was good, for it gave them a real leg up against all the other businesses that were relying on expertise and assumptions alone. But then everyone else started using data, so they had to find some other way to get that competitive edge. So then there was machine learning, and companies really liked this, for it gave them really interesting insights from that data. Plus, it made people think they were intelligent and mysterious and run by robots. But then machine learning became more widely accessible, so they had to find something else to give them that competitive edge. So then came alternative data, and there were even more insights. And it's still a relatively new field, so the companies are still happy for now. But what is alternative data exactly? Well, simply, it's data that's gathered from non-traditional information sources that's used to supplement your existing data. For instance, you might scrape news articles or product reviews to track sentiment, or you might look at satellite imagery to try and gauge footfall or road traffic in a certain area. You might use tweets to inform how you trade on the stock market, or weather patterns to try and predict retail trade. Now, one area of alternative data that we're seeing more and more in the UK, and which I find really, really interesting, is from the world of car insurance. And believe you me, I didn't think I would ever find anything about car insurance remotely interesting, but there you go. Now, for any of you who have never had the great fortune of applying for car insurance, the way it works is this. Typically, you input some personal information about yourself, and then you answer a bunch of questions, and by a bunch, I mean anything up to 75. And most of these questions are kind of what you'd expect insurers to use when trying to gauge how likely you are to get into a car accident. We're talking things like what type of car you have, and how many miles you drive, and your accident record, and things like whether your car is left on the street or in a garage overnight. But then there are other factors that are taken into account that just seem a little bit odd. Things like what job you do and whether or not you're married. And these factors are used because population-wide, they have turned out to be a pretty good proxy for how risky you are. But on an individual level, it can feel pretty unfair that your car insurance would go up by as much as 20%, simply because you've decided to change careers from being a designer to being a travel agent. So what does this have to do with alternative data? Well, one thing that we're seeing an increasing amount of is telematics. Now, the way that telematics works is essentially you get a little black box that sits inside your car. And rather than insurers trying to proxy how risky you are by looking at indirect factors, these actually use direct indicators. So the little black box sends information from your car itself to give you direct indicators of things like how well you're driving. So looking at how many miles you drive and how many of those are at night, and how you accelerate and how you brake and what sort of speeds that you're going at. It gives insurers a much more comprehensive picture, and in return for their data, consumers get a much fairer price, rather than, say, seeing their premiums go up simply because they've recently gotten divorced. So that's a quick overview on some of the things that alternative data can be used for. So imagine now you found a source of alternative data yourself and you think it's going to be revolutionary. What do you need to consider? Well, the usual data morals and best practices still hold, but when it comes to alternative data, it often requires a little bit of extra legwork. So what first? Think about, where has your data come from? Now, this is important with any data that you work with, but with alternative data, it's very likely to have been collected and probably even processed by a third party. It might not be immediately obvious how it's been collected, whether any of the data has been approximated, and how reliably and regularly it's been captured. You should also investigate whether and how it's been verified, particularly if it's data that's come from a user, say. For instance, if you've decided to look at a bunch of Amazon product reviews, consider, have these reviews actually been checked? Do consumers have an incentive to give incorrect information? And it's also worth thinking, is there likely to be a skew? For instance, if users don't have an incentive to give a review, if they don't have to in some way, then you might find you get very strongly positive or very strongly negative reviews, simply because the people who feel a bit meh don't really have as much incentive to leave one. And finally, it's worth checking whether or not you're actually allowed to use the data. Now, there's a bunch of amazing data sources out there, be that from public bodies, from the government, but just because something is publicly available, it doesn't mean you can use it for commercial use. Now, this next point is more about algorithms. Now, we all know that being able to explain how your algorithms work is important, but it becomes even more so when you're dealing with alternative data. How come? Well, alternative data is likely to be a little messier, a little less complete, or even a little more skewed than traditional data. Looking into why you're getting the outputs that you are is a great way of highlighting any issues that you have with the underlying data set. Alternative data is also more likely to give you proxies rather than direct indicators. Now, even if there is a strong correlation between an alternative variable and what you're trying to model, you should be able to understand why that's happening and whether or not it's actually valid. For instance, one thing that came out of the Cambridge Analytica work was that curly fries were correlated with intelligence. Now, this seems like a pretty surprising correlation, but okay. But when you look into it in more detail, it turns out that it was simply because the person who'd set up the Facebook curly fries fan page was someone who was studying at a very prestigious US college. She was of above average intelligence, and because people tend to hang out with people who are like themselves, a lot of her friends were also above average intelligent. These were the friends who were also liking a fan page, and therefore you get a data set that, while it might say that curly fries are correlated with intelligence, it's not really something you can extrapolate out to the wider community. And finally, even if you're happy that your alternative variables hold, that correlations are correct, take the time to check that you're not inadvertently introducing any bias into your model. Now, the standard data science techniques to do this, they'll all work here as well. And there's a bunch of other tools that you can use to help you with that, such as Audit AI, AI Fairness 360, many, many more. And finally, and this is something that we're probably going to be talking about a lot later on, but that is the issue of privacy. Now, alternative data is a fairly new field. It's been around for about 5 years, and it was initially started to be used in the investment space. We're still establishing best practices. So sources of alternative data aren't always that well maintained, simply because you don't end up often using them for what they were originally designed to be used for. You, as an analyst or a data scientist, are probably going to be a little less familiar with the structure and with the content than you are with traditional data sources. And if you're dealing with data split out by individuals, it might not be immediately obvious that there's identifying information in there. So check for identifiers. Now, if there is any PII in there, make sure that it's anonymized. Please, dear God, make sure it's anonymized. That goes down to thinking about how different variables interact with each other, because one variable alone might not be enough to identify an individual, but a combination of them could well be. So think about how they interact. And for this last point, I want to touch on a principle of data that I really like, namely that you should come up with a reason for having any data before you collect it. Hypothesis first. Don't simply mine everything that you can. Now, as data breaches become increasingly common, the less information that you hold on a consumer, the better. This is their personal information. There's no point risking it. And there's frankly no point risking your company's reputation either if it's data that you're not even using. So that has been a brief introduction to alternative data. I'm Sophie Shorten. Thank you for listening.
Great, thank you, Sophie. This is a whistled stop tour. So hold on to your hats. We're going to go straight into the next speaker. So we're joined now by Raluca, building debiasing toolkits. So if I could get you to put on your bits. Raluca has 10 years and more of experience in data science, working with a variety of clients. She's co-founder of ETIQ, or ETIC. I'm just having a stab there. A startup tackling the algorithmic bias problem, and she is also the director of data science at Merkle Aquila. So thank you very much, and take it away.
Hi, I don't know if you guys can hear me all right. So yeah, thank you very much for the intro, Ben, and thank you for having me here. I just want to start by saying that this is kind of my favorite topic, but like a few, so many of us these days, I'm kind of going through a loss period, so my enthusiasm might not be as forthcoming as usual. But yeah, going into the talk itself, at ETIC we spent the past kind of year and a half trying to build a solution to what we kind of what people phrase algorithmic bias problem. And what is the core motivation for us is that while we see kind of visible biases being addressed on a, we're starting to see them being addressed on a regular basis, which is great with what's been happening recently in the US and then elsewhere in the world. We know that there's a lot more kind of hidden biases, which are not maybe coming to the fore as much, and maybe which are not addressed for very good reason, which is that it's a very tough problem. So for instance, the kind of biases we have in mind is demographic, biases related to when certain demographic groups are discriminated against because they are part of the demographic. For instance, the Apple Card scandal in the back of 2019, where the white credit card applicant was routinely, the wives were routinely given like 10, 20 times less the credit card limits as the husbands. And then, everyone knows the examples from justice and kind of recruitment with Amazon. So we think that these kind of problems are maybe not 100% solvable, but certainly we must spend more time mitigating them and to a certain extent solving them and bringing them to the fore, which is why we've kind of dedicated this time to build this tool. So going into the journey we've established, I guess my point of view, I won't go into kind of the research element or anything like that. I'm not a researcher. I'm kind of a data scientist practitioner. And with this type of approach and this type of tooling, the goal is to create something that's super accessible for a lot of us that are, building this project but are quite busy. But while being super accessible and easy to use, it still merges some of the findings in academic community, and it translates them into a simple to use thing so that people actually use it and as a result mitigate this bias. So this is a complex journey, not a complex journey, but a meandering kind of journey, and I think we're still just at the beginning, but I think from the very beginning, once we've kind of set these constraints around building a tool rather than a framework or rather than a research paper, it was very much like from the very beginning, we noticed that there's a bit of a tension in the space between kind of monitoring and mitigating. We think a lot of the tools out there at the moment are focused on the monitoring element, and that's where we personally headed first as well. And the monitoring is around, this model is going to production, and then, okay, what if something goes wrong? And that's a very fair kind of issue. That's a very fair concern to have. It's often the case that once in production, the model behaves very differently from when in kind of training. But beyond that, before it even gets to production, I think we quickly realized that a lot of these things are biased, kind of, not to begin with, but they're biased at the training phase. So, we can keep them very working relatively smoothly in production, but they're still coming up with problematic decisions, problematic for the objects of their of the decision making. So what we've kind of, so the second stage for us was to figure out, okay, so if monitoring maybe is not kind of the key bit that we should address, then when it comes to mitigating, it's about solving the problem. But once you come from monitor, usually when you monitor something, you look at certain metrics. So it's very easy then afterwards to move into solving for those metrics. I mean, very easy, but you have those metrics in mind, and there's a lot of metrics in the literature. I think probably Olivia and the other speakers will, they really know these metrics, but the one we chose was equal opportunity because in a sense, it's a good metric, but it also doesn't make anyone too uncomfortable. I think some of the other key metrics in the literature look at trying to preserve a certain distribution being the same for the demographic group. So, the same proportion of male and female being accepted for a job or whatever it is that they're doing, whatever it is the model is predicting. But equal opportunity is kind of taking a more, shall we say, removed approach from the end outcome and say, oh, the model, in essence, that's not quite right, but the model should work equally well for these different demographics. So this is much more palatable, I think, for people who work in the field. But ultimately, it's just another metric to kind of optimize. It doesn't necessarily assume a distribution, whether for right or wrong reasons. So once we picked this metric, actually what we found is that when you kind of set up the problem in that way, like you have this massive problem algorithmic bias, no one knows how to solve it, so forth. But if you're focused, okay, well, we're not going to solve the algorithmic bias problem, we're going to optimize for this metric within these constraints, which are, the pre-processing stage and whatever else we kind of chose based on what we thought our users could, use. It wasn't, it was a problem to solve like any other, like the kind that research papers are full of. And, we did a relatively okay job, but as we are moving through the solutions, and I think, so he mentioned some of the other, the packages out there, that's what they're doing. They're really optimizing for a metric. But as we kind of moved to the solution, we developed the solution, we realized, okay, the big advantage here can be gained not by necessarily optimizing for the metric, but by surfacing the sources of the bias themselves. By getting the people who build these models to think through the lens of, okay, are there some is there some discrimination factors that I'm not really thinking about, I'm not really taking into account, which lead me to these outcomes for my model? And this is a very, it's not that it's a different approach. I think as we're moving, as the space is moving and the field is advancing, we're finding that more and more of these kind of organizations where we're talking to are getting in the same place, essentially. This is about kind of, it's much easier to look at the process holistically and find, think about the sources of bias than it is to just blindly optimize for a metric. Yeah, so this is, in essence, this is just like our initial part of the journey. I think once we've gotten that, this is probably where we were about half a year ago. Once we got at that space, there were a lot more things that people wanted, users want things that you don't necessarily kind of prepare for. There's a big push for, explainability that's already been mentioned, but explainability with the GL, it's not really enough to debias things or not really enough to mitigate bias. It's really about showing your work. And so what we're motivated by is like this idea of bias mitigation, and what kind of keeps us going forward. yeah, so thanks for that, Ben. I hope I didn't overrun too much.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you for that presentation and for bearing with us with all kinds of different people's internet connections and audio and all this sort of stuff. So thank you for bearing with us. We're going to run into the next talk now, which is by Olivia Gamblin, Ethical Innovation for Responsible Tech. So Olivia is an AI ethicist. She has a MSc in philosophy and a BA in philosophy and entrepreneurship. She has some tech experience in that world, and she founded Ethical Intelligence, where she leads a remote team, and she also works with academia and companies and all sorts. So take it away, Olivia. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. So as Ben stressed, I'm coming from an ethicist point of view. I am a philosopher by trade and training. Doesn't mean I can't speak tech though, so this is going to be fun. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully it's the correct one and I'm not sharing notes on accident. Done that before. But I'm going to talk a bit today about ethics and long-term innovation. Since we hear a lot of times the excuse for not considering ethics in your technological development cycles, that ethics hinders innovation. Well, I'm going to call bullcrap on that, and we're going to go through why exactly ethics actually helps unlock some long-term innovation. So we're going to actually start though first with just a simple definition of what is ethics. Being the philosopher that I am, I like to concentrate on definitions. And this one's quite entertaining actually. Normally in person, I love asking this question to a live audience and getting the responses, because I often get very interesting responses. Everything from ethics is a moral code that we live by. Ethics tells us who to run over with the self-driving car. Usually something about ethics tells us where the Nazis went wrong. So it's quite an interesting amount of answers that I'll get to just this one simple question. But really, when it all boils down to it, ethics is simply the study of right and wrong. So what we're looking at when we're saying ethics in tech, we're looking at the decisions that we're making, what constitutes a right decision, a wrong decision in that specific situation. So boiling it all down, it's simply we're trying to understand what is right and what is wrong. So going on from there, you're probably thinking, okay, well then how in the world does ethics and tech relate in terms of this long-term innovation idea? So in order to get us to this conclusion that ethics does in fact lead to long-term innovation, I'm going to walk us through two popular myths around ethics that I want to dispel. So the first one is that ethics is a blocker to technology. As I said, when first starting out, often the excuse given for not considering ethics is that ethics hinders innovation, that it slows us down, that it becomes a blocker to fun, interesting technology that we want to explore. But if we constantly have to go through this checklist of ethics, if we constantly have to stop and say no to different directions because of ethics, then it becomes this blocker. So we're dealing with this myth. Now, I want to actually discuss really quick the concept of technical debt, but not exactly technical debt as you know it. So what I want to actually instead discuss is this idea of ethical debt. And what that means is it's very analogous to technical debt. And it's essentially the ethical decisions that you're taking on early throughout your development cycle that actually comes back to hurt you later on down the road, because you've made a decision that you either did not recognize was an ethical decision, or recognized and made a decision, not necessarily a bad decision. Again, not saying that you are a bad person when you make a bad ethical decision. Sometimes you don't have all of the input required or the support and expertise of someone that's trained to recognize ethical decisions. What this does though, is as you're making these decisions, you're slowly collecting ethical debt. And if you don't go back to fix, let's say, some of these holes later down the line, what you're going to do is you're going to run into this reputational risk, this potential to have your entire system break down, not on a technical level, but on an ethical level. And what that means is society having pushback. So You have, for example, there was a software company that would give predictions for prison sentences. And because it was not checked early on what kind of data they were using, what biases sat in that data early on, later on down the line, it became very evident that they had a racist system. And what that ended up doing was crashing not the technical side. The technical side was working great, but the ethical side came crumbling down, and there was a huge pushback from society. And that company took a very hard hit from the reputational side, and they had to go back and really start from scratch from the very beginning on. So when it comes to ethics being a blocker to technology, really what it's actually doing is it's a safeguard. It's not a blocker, it's a safeguard. So when an ethical principle or a code is telling you no, that's because further on down the line, you are going to run into bigger, larger problems. You're going to be causing harm if you're crossing that line that ethics is saying, no, don't do that. So from that standpoint, ethics actually isn't a blocker to technology. It's actually a safeguard. It's a risk mitigator. Now, the other myth I want to dispel is this idea that constraints are an obstacle for innovation. And constraints here meaning ethical codes, ethical values, principles of conduct. So the idea is, okay, well, if I have any type of constraints on my thinking, then of course those are obstacles. I don't have free reign. I can't go and do all of these crazy ideas in my head because I've got constraints, and that's an obstacle to my innovation. Well, actually, I want to read just a quick quote actually from the Harvard Business Review, and it says, constraints can foster innovation when they represent a motivating challenge and focused efforts on a more narrowly defined way forward. Simply put, ethics can foster innovation. Ethics work as those guidelines that are needed as you're developing your technology. You can think of it in this way. So when you are given a problem to solve, and you know that in order to solve that problem, your solution has to fit within 4 sides of a box. You've got your technical limitations, we'll call those. You've got the 4 sides of your box. Those are your technical limitations. That's where your technical capacities end. And so you know that your solution to this problem must fit within those 4 edges. You can start to then develop, okay, I can't pursue teleportation, but I can send information over the internet, that kind of thing. What happens once you add in this layer of ethics? Yes, it can be viewed as a constraint, but instead what it's doing is it's popping out that box from that 2D vision into a 3D box where you really understand even better where your solution needs to fall into place. So instead of going, okay, I have all of these different options, what can I even pursue? You're narrowing down those options. So you're going, okay, these are actually the best options, both technically and ethically. And what you have to do instead there is it's forcing you out of complacency of just making something that's technically capable. But instead of just making something that's only technically capable, you're now making something that's technically and ethically acceptable. So you're adding on just another standard that you need to meet, which requires actually even more innovation than if you had just said, okay, I've met my technical limitations, or I've met my technical capacity. This is great, I'm done. No, you're actually having to think beyond that and fit 2 different guidelines here. So in that case, having ethics as a constraint, not even a constraint, but ethics and ethical principles as guidelines, what you're doing is, again, forcing yourself to take a step even further in terms of innovation. So with that all being said, this is just a nice little way to get in touch with us. With Ethical Intelligence, we work with entrepreneurs and SMEs specifically in embedding ethics into their workflow and their technology. But just to summarize those points real quick, ethics actually is a key to unlocking long-term innovation. It's not a blocker to technology. Instead, it's actually a risk mitigator. It's safeguarding you from potential disastrous outcomes that, of course, no one wants. We all want to do good by our technology. Ethics is an enabler in that direction. So it helps protect us throughout our development cycles and innovation there, as well as it's actually a stimulator in terms of innovation because it's forcing us beyond just a simple, I'm meeting my technical limitations, I'm meeting my technical requirements. I'm actually going above and beyond and having to be even more innovative to make sure that my technology is also fitting within the ethics. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take a breath. I think I made it in 10 minutes. I can't see my clock, so.
That was perfect, thank you. So thank you very much, Olivia. Obviously getting in touch with all of our speakers there. Olivia has given you some information there, but you can check out the website to get in contact with the speakers from today. So we're going to go into the final lightning talk before we go into the Q&A. So again, if you put your Q&A questions on the Q&A board, and then we can get to them and feed those into the Q&A later on, which is going to run shortly until about 2:30-ish. So finally, we have Steph Locke, building debiasing toolkits. She's a data scientist, author turned entrepreneur. Steph is passionate about helping businesses use their data more effectively and adopting AI. And she's co-founded Nightingale HQ. So I'll hand over to you, Steph.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming along today. So I'm not talking about debiasing toolkits. I am talking about the ethics of using AI in the workplace to help monitor for things like social distancing. So I've already been introduced, and as Ben said, you can grab my contact details from the Zoom chat, and I'd love to get in touch with anybody who would like to discuss this further. I do have a philosophy degree, bachelor's, but with a solid maths background. It is a really useful degree when thinking about technology because it helps us structure our thinking towards making sure that we use the right technology at the right time, rather than just thinking because we can, we should. So inside the workplace and our public spaces, it is so important, particularly right now, that we are reducing health and safety risks. We have a pandemic. We don't want more people to suffer. And I think we hit 50,000 deaths in the UK so far because of COVID. So it's no longer just a checklist. It is something that we need to be putting into practice, and we can be leveraging technology to help us deliver on this goal of a safer workplace. We can monitor in all sorts of ways. So in some ways, you've got the standard like productivity things, and you might have heard some of the horror stories about like taking pictures of people whilst they're working from home at intervals. But on a practical level and on a safety level, using computer vision, we can detect issues. So this is great in high-risk environments, historically like construction and manufacturing, where it is important to reduce the risk of a significant accident. But we can take it a step further with machine learning almost at the CCTV level. We can be detecting whether people are socially distanced, whether they have their protective equipment on. And there is some indication that temperature sensing can support identification of people who might not even know that they're ill at the moment. So there's a lot of benefits that we can be getting from monitoring in the workplace. Like with most things though, it's not about the benefits, but making sure that we don't give ourselves so many problems that we outweigh those benefits. And to quote Dr. Pepper, what's the worst that could happen? This is a long-term thing to think about, both from a philosophy perspective and from a business perspective. We need to think about what are the risks, what are their impacts, and what are their probabilities. So it all sounds great. We're helping people in socially distance, but what negative outcomes can there be about it? What would have bad ethical implications, and what can we then do to mitigate or minimize the risk of that negative ethical consequence? So it is a great question, and hopefully things as a result don't work out quite disastrously if we work on this. So like with the data collection, the alternative data collection presentation, there is a lot of risks and ethical considerations with the data we're collecting. So the impact of a breach is really a strong one. So people's, when you're collecting information like their temperature, you are collecting medical information. This is one of the most sensitive types of personally identifiable information, and it could lead to really serious breaches of privacy if that data gets out. We've also seen with some of the contact tracing apps and people's location tracking during COVID that there have been attempts by law enforcement to use that data to basically charge people for crimes, for things like not socially distancing. And there's more than 175 discrete parts of legislation that can cause different types of government authorized investigators to request electronic data like you might capture through AI monitoring in the workplace. So if somebody comes to work, they might need to, for financial reasons, they cross a county boundary during lockdown, the data you gather might end up being subject to a warrant and end up with that person potentially facing charges. That brings you into a really gnarly situation where, yes, they're breaking public health measures, the public good is something to be thinking about, but also you have kind of a duty of care to your employees. So when we're thinking about our data collection, as we add more of this, we are stepping more and more into a situation where we have less chance to have a good outcome for people. And finally, no system is perfect, and one of the big risks that we can face is insider use. If we have data that is public data, medical data, data about people's coming and going, extensive tracking around your buildings, other employees who have issues or are looking to harass employees could leverage this data for their own gain. So just collecting the data, we open ourselves, our employees, up to ethical issues that were previously not in scope for the data that we collected. And we also, if people are showing up to work and they feel compelled to because they're, even though they know they're ill, then we should be asking ourselves the question of, are we an ethical and good employer? And perhaps we should be addressing some of the cultural challenges. Once we start using the data to monitor our workplace, we have further issues. So the first one is that computer vision has historically been rife with bias. Many of the data sets used to produce object detection, people detection algorithms, facial recognition have been very biased towards Caucasian groups. this has meant that it performs poorly and inaccurately across different groups. As a result, you could end up with parts of your groups of your employees being generating alerts about social distancing more often than others because the model doesn't perform correctly. So we need to work out and validate that when we're using it, that it has fair and consistent outcomes across all our employees. We should be thinking about the impact that our model can have. So if we say somebody isn't socially distancing, they might have a hidden disability and they're actually exempt, but we end up pulling them into HR, causing them distress, and risking disciplinary procedures and possibly financial outcomes. So the impact that we can have by using this data can have strongly negative consequences for our employees. And similarly, what happens if and when we get it wrong? I mean, the science is still formative. Models are always wrong but useful. And if we might interpret it incorrectly, what happens to make sure that we get it right? So what we can do is make sure that we build trust in these systems to make sure it adopts quickly. First and foremost, consult your employees. What do they feel comfortable with that helps them balance their safety, their physical safety, with their mental well-being? Make sure that you get consent for the data, the storage, and the use. Set up clear policies and safeguards to make sure that the data will be used responsibly and have as fair a set of outcomes for employees as possible. And critically, make sure that you validate the results and your suppliers to make sure that the solutions you're buying do live up to the standards you expect of the solution. So thank you all very much. Ask questions in the panel. Do get in touch afterwards. Thank you. Over to you, Ben.
Hello, so thanks very much for all the speakers for giving your lightning talks. It's quite difficult to fit so much into a short space of time, so really well done on kind of keeping roughly to time, everyone. If I could invite you all to put on your cameras and your audio, that'd be awesome. Or maybe mute yourself unless you're going to talk. And now we have a whole stream of questions. So there's some questions that we wanted to ask anyway, or some questions the speakers wanted to ask, and some coming through from the chat. And again, thanks very much for everyone who's given a question, and hopefully we'll get to as many as we can before we tip off around 2:30. So I've got a whiteboard here, which I've been collecting some questions. So I believe the first one was to Steph, which was about text to speech on the presentation. I believe that's a Zoom thing. You were sharing is that right?
No, that's a PowerPoint thing. So if you've got PowerPoint for Windows, you can go and you can turn it on. It's also multilingual, so you can speak in a variety of languages and also have the subtitles output to a different set of languages. So I don't just use it from an accessibility perspective, but when I present internationally, I'm able to speak in English, but have Portuguese subtitles and things like that. It is coming to Zoom soon. I believe it's already in Microsoft Teams and Google Meet, so that you can have accessible live captions inside day-to-day meetings.
Wicked, thank you. I mean, that's a super useful tool. I wonder if you're a Portuguese speaker, whether it actually gets it like relatively correctly, if you can speak bilingually. Who knows? So let's move into, there's been quite a few questions around kind of culture and the role of the different individuals in this kind of chain. So we've got kind of law and lawmakers and policy, and then we've got companies, and then we've got individuals and teams. And I was wondering if we could first kind of tackle the different kind of roles that people can play, and how you think that different individuals in that kind of cycle have to deal with the ethics of the situation. So if we start with Sophie, as she was the first to speak, I was just wondering what you think about individuals' role, I guess, in this kind of minutiae that we're speaking about. What can individuals do, or data scientists do?
So I think for data scientists, their kind of immediate starting point is they're often the ones who are working with the data. So I think for them, it's firstly really understanding how the data that they're dealing with has been captured, how it's been processed, trying to understand whether sort of any inherent biases or skews within the data. But I also think that they've got a role as individuals, and that comes down to really understanding their biases. You know, there's a lot of work you can do to understand how you might bias against certain groups, even if you don't really mean to. I mean, everyone's upbringing will shape their view of what is normal. So even if you're a very open-minded individual, even just thinking, okay, this is what's normal, will inadvertently skew against some other groups. One example I really like is we look at wedding dresses around the world. When you say sort of wedding dress or wedding attire to someone, they immediately think of probably person in tux and woman in white dress. And that's not what weddings look like all over the world. And so it really shapes your view of what is normal. And I think that also comes down to hiring diversely as well. You're not going to become some well-rounded, perfectly non-biased individual. No one is. But the more diversely you can hire, and the more different people you can speak to, I think that really helps with the whole situation.
Yeah, and I guess that bridges into kind of what can companies and cultures in companies do as well. So I was wondering if I could throw that over to Raluca, if that's okay. Your audio.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I mean, how should I? There are, so the last kind of view of the metrics, there are 3 ones that we're looking at very closely are demographic parity, equal opportunity, and equal odds. Demographic parity is based for men versus women, but that's kind of you don't really know. Equal opportunity and equal odds are very similar in that they're about looking at metrics as to how well the model is working for the different demographics. So equal opportunities like true rate of true positives, and equal odds includes a condition on rate of true negatives as well. However, some of the regulation, if you look at GDPR, for instance, it's kind of moving towards individual fairness. Sorry, can you hear me all right? It's moving towards individual fairness. And what individual fairness says is that if you have similar individuals, you should treat that way. And that, so this is like 4 metrics. There's a few more. There's really a lot, and there's really a lot.
I'm going to have to stop you, Lucas. Oh, there you finished. It's fine. I think your audio is a bit choppy. I don't know if the other panelists were getting something similar. I don't know if you could do us a internet speed test and see if you can speed yourself up. That'd be awesome. So I guess, Olivia, do you have any opinion on the legal aspect? Where does regulation come into all of this? And is it up to regulators to help companies, punish companies? How's that work?
So the role of regulation is quite interesting. One of the pieces that I always start off with there is a difference between being legal and being ethical. Legality is very important. I won't downplay that, but it's only the baseline. If you meet the legal requirements, you are basic. That's it. You're not ahead, you're not advanced, you're not leading, you're basic. And that's great. That's where we should all be. That's the baseline establishment. But if you're looking to lead in this field, then you have to be advanced, which is where ethics comes into play. Another comment there in terms of regulation, it is, again, very important. It gets everyone on the same page. But I think there is becoming this tendency to offload our responsibility onto government, as in, I don't have to be legal or take responsibility for any of my actions as a company because there are no regulations telling me I can't do this. So it's the government's fault that I screwed up because there was no one telling me not to. Again, that's not correct. You weren't acting ethically. You weren't considering your own actions and your own role to play. So just because that we're still waiting, so to speak, on the government to come up with these regulations and these policies does not give us this free-for-all Wild West in between time where we get to do what we want and just blame it because there's no regulation. So regulation, again, very much needed. It's a very integral part of this ecosystem, but it does not become this offload of our accountability.
Zing. Cool. So we've all got a part to play is basically what we're saying here. Companies, individuals, governments, stepping up to the plate and being more ethical, I guess, and being more concerned with everyone's well-being, which would be nice, wouldn't it? It'd be great. Does anyone else want to step in on the kind of culture side and what individuals or companies and governments and legal structures can do for this before we move on to a different subject? Anyone just take the mic off and give it a go? If not, then we can move on and we can come back to that later. I guess we'll mull it over. Next, we have this kind of idea that, I'm looking at my board, here we go, a question from Victoria to Steph, I think, about this idea of safety and privacy. And is that not a conflict that actually you want people to be, you have both of those things, right? You want them to be safe and be private, and giving up some privacy for safety might actually put you in a different type of harm's way. So I just wondered if you had a comeback for that.
It is something that we've struggled with as we've become increasingly surveilled, and from CCTV to the internet. We give up a significant amount of privacy on the basis that fundamentally our government and various institutions will offer us protection. It is a continuing balance to make sure that, whether it's making sure that a government has sufficient restrictions on their powers in using our data, the increasing centralization of the data inside commercial entities who are using that data not the way that most of us would hope. It is why many, many people were distrusting of contact tracing applications, and there's been huge pushback on that level of monitoring. It is very, very understandable that we want our privacy maintained, but we also want to be safe. And it is, to a certain extent, a trade-off. So there are situations like in AI, things like federated learning are advancing so that we can start building solutions and differential privacy that help us build models kind of at people's device level and embrace a more private development approach, or use synthetic data. And there's tools, but it is so much easier for businesses to gather all the data, to invade the privacy and use that to improve health and safety. And that is the thing that we have to do. So a lot of the great work that Raluca and stuff are doing around building and solutions to help us gain insight into bias in our data, helping us solve some of these kind of critical data science and model development challenges, but also that awareness at the business level that we can't just always take the easiest path to health and safety.
Wow. Okay. So it's a rocky road to get to where we're going. Yeah.
And it's always going to be incentivized for people to do it the bad way.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's cheaper and makes more money.
Cool. So maybe we'll tackle that in a bit. I have a question for Raluca around kind of key metrics. So I guess we're getting our data science hats back on and going, you know, when we're actually trying to de-bias or make sense out of our data, what are the key metrics that we are looking for, dealing with, creating better accuracy scores for, removing all of those things?
Okay, so hopefully you guys can hear me all right now. So in terms of the metrics, so obviously, like I mentioned, there are quite a few definitions of bias, and it's all contextual and so forth. But some of the more well-known ones are demographic parity, equal opportunity, and equal odds. These are kind of more easy to comprehend metrics in the sense that it's like a number. It's not like, you know, you need the whole methodology behind it. Demographic parity is just proportion of the, you know, like accepted out of total population for a demographic. So you would expect, for instance, that a similar proportion of women to men are accepted for a job. However, the community, especially the research community, is very against this metric because it assumes there is a known distribution, which is parity, and that's kind of like an assumption, right? The other two metrics that I think some of the stats professors are pushing a little bit more heavily are equal opportunity and equal odds, which are more about how the statistical model works. So does it work equally well for the different demographics? And they're basically the same metric with some differences. And I think beyond this kind of one number type metric, which tells us something, but usually an indicator, there are movements towards looking at individual fairness, which is trying to express whether similar individuals are treated the same. So there's a few different metrics here, but they're usually kind of, you know, sometimes based on clustering, sometimes based on counterfactuals. So there isn't like very clear then framework from the first three I mentioned. Yeah, these are some examples. There literally are much more, but yeah, everyone, it's a hectic field over here. So.
I guess we'll get in contact with you for some more specifics on that one, or check out the website, I guess, as well, for more information. So I have a question, which is around education. And I think this one was echoed kind of by a few people to do with culture and individuals. But I was just wondering how much we should be imbuing designers, developers, data scientists, analysts with some of this ethical thinking, reflection, historical context, all these sorts of things. What kinds of things should we be teaching in our education or training for these types of roles? So I'm happy for anyone to come in for this one.
So the perfect answer would be we teach everybody all the things. But there is a limited amount of time. So I think the thing that I found easiest to help both business leaders and technical people who are thinking about solutions to business problems to deliver them in an ethical way is thinking about processes and effectively checklists and things that people can put into place to help make sure that they spur the right discussions and the right thinking. So it's at the top level, making sure they understand that the high level outcomes, the macro scale, and then making sure that individuals are equipped with thinking about things in their area.
I'd love to jump in here as well. So kind of a two-part answer, so to speak. I'll do it from a philosophical perspective real quick first. So we have a few different schools of ethical frameworks, two of which you have consequentialist and deontological. Those are rules and principle based. So they're looking at the duty that someone has to follow a set moral principle, a set moral code. So the focus is on that kind of checklist mindset even. Then you've got this outlier called virtue ethics, and that focus is actually on the person and making the person more moral. The combination of the two of them actually is really what we should be aiming for. So this comes back to education, I promise. We've got the checklists and we've got the codes from the consequentialist, from the deontological ethics side. So we have principles that we're following and that we need to abide by. But then from the educational standpoint, we're also concentrating on the person behind it all. So when it comes to looking at designers and developers, training them literally to ask why. They're trained to ask how. That's great. But in these situations, that critical thought process of, I also need to ask why I'm doing this, becomes essential. And what that means, they don't need to be able to answer the why. There are ethicists trained for that exact purpose. They just need to be trained to make sure they're asking that why and asking it to get the right input that they need. So it's an ecosystem. It's not a simple, here, take this one afternoon class and you'll be able to handle all ethical questions ever coming in your direction. No, it's an ecosystem of working with ethicists, but also being able to stand on your own and recognize the situations that you're in.
I see it as good as a habit.
Yes,
We
exactly.
help people form that habit through processes, education, and helping repeat the experience and give them positive reinforcement to continue that culturally.
Exactly.
Awesome. A little bit defensive at the end there, Olivia. We're not going to take your jobs, all right? We're going to make some AI that are ethical AI.
I didn't mean to, so sorry.
No. Who knows? Ethical chatbots. I'm just going to go and make a new startup. I got a funny question which requires a show of hands. So we were asked if companies are doing well in their use of AI technologies and tools. So are they doing well ethically? This is kind of broad. So give us a hands up or a hands, or like a thumbs down or thumbs up if you think that they are doing well broadly, or are they doing badly? What do you think? Middling. Okay, so my follow-up question is, can you name anyone who's doing well? Because I think it's pretty easy to name people who are doing poorly, I would imagine. But can you think of anyone who's using tools and really doing a good job at this kind of ethical side? Or maybe they are kind of going under the radar a little bit because they're not in the news for doing bad things. I don't know if you have any really good examples. It's always hard to think of good examples of good stuff, isn't it?
So a lot of the big effective use of AI is still concentrated in very big companies. As a result, we end up with that middle ground of some areas will be doing it great, some areas will be a little less ethical. So for instance, Microsoft as a company, they have apps like Seeing AI to help people with visual impairments better get about their day. They do a bunch of things, but they only recently blocked governments from using their facial recognition technology. But GitHub, which they own, still has contracts with ICE, for instance, for their enterprise server. So that there is levels of ethical use of various things at different stages, and it's so hard because it's in these big corporates to say it's not all good and it's not all bad. It's hopefully tending towards good, which that's the journey we should all be on.
Yeah, I think I would often look at the sort of companies who are kind of not-for-profits who are really pushing the big companies to improve their ethics. So companies like the Algorithmic Justice League or the Center for Humane Technology, the Open Data Institute. I think with the big companies, as Steph said, it's often examples of little pockets where they're doing it well, and then also little pockets where they're doing it badly. Plus, there's also the idea that ethics is very subjective. So one person's good is not going to be everyone's ethically good.
So, Sophie, we've got a question which we can all answer, but I was just wondering if you had a idea of kind of this awareness. Like, we wouldn't be here talking about ethics maybe 5 years ago, let's say, about the ethics of AI. It would be a very niche topic, I would imagine. I certainly started my podcast back then. Check it out. And I just wondered where we're going to be in 5 years' time. Do you see kind of this really coming in and being really, really useful companies? We're seeing much better products and our well-being being upheld, or do you see this fight being kind of hard won and ongoing? You know, what's the next 5 years look like, do you think, with the good view of ethics? Because we're all here for a reason, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do see it. I mean, I don't see it as a battle that's going to be won in the next 5 years. I think, frankly, it's a battle that's probably never going to be won, simply because ethics is subjective and there are always going to be ways that we can improve. That being said, I think we have, over the past decade, reached the stage where when sort of bad decisions made within the AI world have started to have real world consequences. So, for instance, we've seen suicide rates increasing when Facebook introduced their like button and Twitter introduced their sort of retweets. And we've started to see, in 2016, we saw the impact that Facebook had on the election. And I think it's when these sort of quite subjective questions of, oh, should these companies have that much power, and how much should we really care about our privacy? I think once people start seeing the real world impact, that's when you start to ask these questions, which is why I think it's only really become a topic in the last 5 years. But I think those questions will stick around. I think people are increasingly aware of them, and I think as you see the people who are in school, at university, just starting out in their careers, when these questions started being asked, I think and I hope they will continue to ask those questions, and they won't sort of let it fade back into the background over the next 5 years. So yeah, I think we'll still be fighting, but I think that's a positive as well.
Awesome. So somewhat related, I guess, is I was wondering, Olivia, if you happen to know a way of telling whether something is an ethical use of AI. I mean, the easiest one to talk about is obviously lethal autonomous war weapons and things like that. Are there just things that we shouldn't be doing? Are there obvious kind of like, this is totally evil, guys, and we can't do this? And how do we know, when we're creating our new startup or making our new projects, how can we tell? Olivia.
You broke out right at the beginning of your question, so I was kind of crossing my fingers that it wasn't me that you called on, because I completely missed who it was you were directing the question to. Well, that answered my question. It was me. That's a really good question, because it's very difficult. If we take it too far to the extreme, then we can come up with a reason that all forms of AI should be outlawed in a way, because taken to extremes, it can result in disastrous outcomes and consequences for all different types. Even there's a fun philosophical thought problem where you tell a system that you must optimize making paper clips, and all of a sudden it's turned the world into a giant paperclip because that was the only way to optimize for that end goal. So in any way, you can always take a solution, you can take an application to the extreme. It's up to us as a society to understand where are the limits for these types of technology. Just because something is technically feasible does not mean it needs to be created. It does imply that there is a chance that someone will try to create it somewhere down the line, even if we've decided as a society, no, this is not good. But having that understanding, for example, lethal autonomous weapons, there are a lot of arguments for and against, and we're still trying to battle that out of understanding, okay, is it something that is ethically acceptable or not? A lot of that is based on culture. Different cultural aspects and different cultural perspectives will have a different way in on all of those. So we are we are in this moment of trying to understand how do we balance out cultural differences and perspectives. A lot of the answers can lie there quite easily. You look at, for example, a pacifist society, they would say, no, we would never create lethal autonomous weapons. But then you look at, let's say, some areas in the States who would say, of course, lethal autonomous weapons because it protects our soldiers. And then there can be reasons in all these different directions. So it is a culturally sensitive topic. We're still looking for a solution about how to balance these all out. So really the solution right now is to have patience with each other and to have patience to understand that your own perspective and your own ethical code is not everyone else's. That's okay. A good way to understand if the application is truly evil at the base of it, or something that can be saved and turned more ethical, is just look at the impact it's having on the people around you. If you see, for example, the like button is increasing suicides, there's a good chance that that is not a good application. And it's okay to recognize in hindsight. It's not okay to recognize in hindsight and not do anything. So it's okay to recognize, say you're wrong, and go and fix it. That's where we need to head, I think, instead of trying to go, this application is evil, we won't touch it. It's okay, we've seen the consequence, we messed up, let's fix it.
So I'm full of japes today, aren't I? So thanks for that. I was wondering if we talked a lot about kind of privacy and data debiasing. So I was wondering if we had kind of resources or tools that we actually can talk about, so that we have kind of these amazing things that we can just give people, they should check out today, or if they're data scientists, they should check out today. And if they are just interested, then go check them out at their own time. Are there any recommendations that you guys have for maybe helping with that personal data issue and helping with that debiasing within models issue as well? So I'm sure there's lots of comments on this question. Raluca.
Yeah, sure. So obviously I'm biased on this, but we're always happy to help. We're looking for users to test our stuff. So to see people at least check it out, because that's the first step as well. So for instance, there's a Fairness 360. I think Microsoft is coming up with something which is not quite open source, but hey ho. There's numerous. There's the Ethical Institute has a nice little repository online, which is great for a host of things beyond just explainability and bias, into moving into MLOps and so forth. So it's a really, there's some really good links. I'll try to post some on here. And yeah, of course, just come talk to us as well. That's what we do, kind of thing. So yeah.
Sophie, do you have any resources?
Yeah, so I think in addition to the AI Fairness 360, which Raluca just mentioned, there's also tools like FairML. Google's got a tool, I think, What If technology. All of these look at sort of how your models work and the sort of underlying data sets to try and say, you know, are there any particular skews? But I think there is also a case of just education reading around this. It's all very well and good to run your models through certain software, but I think understanding why it's an issue, really taking the initiative to look out for these things, particularly if these tools are black boxes in themselves, the better you can understand and try to replicate them yourself, the better.
Steph, do you have any to add?
Yeah, I've put a presentation on tools and practices and a bunch of further reading in the chat.
Awesome. Olivia, happen to have any? Oh, I got another question if not.
No exact tools, but I can make a comment here that there is a difference between values and bias, and there is such thing as ethical bias. As we saw with that privacy security playoff, what you favor is a bias. It's not a bad bias. It just means what you're going to prioritize, and that will result in different outcomes. So that was just a side comment.
Yeah, awesome. So I always like to say, you're looking for bias, you're just not looking for negative bias, the bad stuff in your models. Anyway, I was wondering if we could follow that resources through. We obviously have your company, Olivia, and your skills and your blogs and articles and stuff like that. Can you recommend any other way to go and find more information about AI and ethics?
Actually, there is an organization called All Tech is Human, and they just released a responsible tech guide. I think it was in September. That is a beautifully brilliant guide of just the ecosystem of responsible tech, all of the different players. It, instead of looking at kind of the big shiny organizations that work in this field, it's actually concentrating on all of us grassroots guys who are slowly building up this wider community. It details a lot of different organizations at play in this field, as well as a lot of individuals and their profiles, so you can start to understand who and what expertise exists out there to help guide in these kind of decision-making processes. So I would say check out All Tech is Human. They also feature a lot of different webinars and talks. Overall, just a great resource. Also, Ben, this doesn't work, you're here. I usually recommend your podcast. So I recommend Ben's podcast, and also Radical AI is another great one. Those are some good ones.
Thank you. It's embarrassing. Anyone else would like to plug some ethical resources?
There's a charity called We and AI, which is trying to put out a lot of different kind of, how should I put it, not long documents, if you know what I mean. Something that can be digested a little bit faster than, reading through a document type thing. I can try to put their website in here as well.
Sweet.
Oh yeah, they've come up. I think their focus has been on race, yeah.
There's lots of links going up in the chat, on the Zoom chat, so check those out. Sophie, do you have anything to add?
I think not many to sort of all the ones that have been mentioned. As Olivia said, ton of great podcasts out there, including your own. I think you've also got lots of small companies doing the more concise documents. You've got ones like AI Ethics, the Ada Lovelace Institute, you've got Ethics Explorer, just many to get involved in.
And Steph.
There we go, finally managed it. The Algorithmic Justice League, very cool work that they're doing. If people want a couple book recommendations to read whilst they're kind of doing their fake commutes that I think people, a lot of people are increasingly doing. Classics are Weapons of Mass Destruction and Invisible Women.
God, the book recommendations as well. There's a whole list of those. But if you want to have any more recommendations from attendees for the panel, put them in the chat. That will help us all later. It'd be awesome. We'll also, I think there's going to be a continuation on this on the Slack. So there will be a link going up in the chat to the Slack if you want to continue this chat. I am going to take this opportunity to thank you, the audience, for coming today and spending your lunch break or your early afternoon with us and to talk about this exceptionally important, interesting, and confusing and strange thing, which is ethics and AI. So thanks very much for joining us today. Go check out the rest of the Data Science Festival for the rest of this month. I'm going to thank the panelists. Thank you all. And then I'm going to ask a final question, which is kind of open-ended, so we can see where that takes us. But before I do that, thank you to Steph, Sophie, Olivia, and Raluca. So thank you very much. And I wish there was like an audience that we could all clap. So if you're at home, could you just, I don't know, a little clap or an emoji in the chat? That'd be nice. Thank you for your talks and your wisdom. So thanks, guys. There you go. That was the clap, the ovation. So a fun and silly and interesting question to finish. We have this idea of AI, which is mostly talked about in response to kind of machine learning, these algorithms that some of you might know, supervised and unsupervised, reinforcement learning, these different types of categories of stuff going on. But there's this original idea of kind of making intelligent machines, right? And I was just wondering if people had an idea whether we are going to get to AI consciousness or general intelligence. Is that going to happen? And it'd be nice just to have a yay or nay hand waving in the air. What do you think? I'll give you kind of like a 50-year leeway. 50 years time, general AI, what do we think? Mostly no's, kind of, not really. Ooh.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that the biggest challenge that we have is, and quantum computing might contribute heavily towards our ability, but right now, AI for like weak targeted AI is far too power and compute intensive. And it has a fundamental complexity constraint towards generalizing because of how much it takes to arrive at its capability. Ben, you're on mute.
Damn it! I knew I would do it at one point. Sorry, everyone. So there's always one, isn't there? It's doing so well. Is it even ethically reasonable to be doing this at all? Is the question that we had on the Q&A. Should we be making conscious machines? Is that a good thing to be doing, or is that maybe going to slide into the evil pile over here? What do we think?
I think it opens up a world of chaos. If we assign moral agency to machines, then turning them off is considered killing them. So I think that's a route. There are not many roads that I say don't go down. That's one that I say don't go down. That's just, it's not going to go well for us if we end up in that direction.
So Olivia says no. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you sort of, until we are considerably further down the sort of ethical road than we are currently, I think we're just not equipped at the moment to be able to deal with the problems that it'll throw at us and sort of all the ethical questions. I mean, I wouldn't say this about a lot of innovation, but we have plenty of other things to be worrying about. So I would focus on those first.
Well, everything's fine. What are you talking about, Sophie? I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, let's like not be racist and remove human slavery and things like that, and then worry about machines who would be in a similar position to how we treat other humans right now.
Has anyone got a counterpoint to that? Thinks it's a good idea? Raluca, do you think it's a good idea?
I mean, I don't know if it's a good idea, but I think, you know, things are moving in a certain direction. It's about trying, you know, so all it takes is a group of people who think it's a good idea and then they're going to build it, and, you know, it's better to be part of the conversation than not, kind of thing. It's but
Yeah,
that's pragmatic.
Well, we will save the rest of that conversation for another day. Thanks again to all our panelists. Thank you for bearing with the audio and the internet connection and all that sort of stuff. Thanks for your questions, and hope you enjoy the other Data Science Festival talks, and we'll see you all another time. So thanks very much. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
And thanks, Ben, for moderating.
Thank you.